Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to Malawi, a sliver of a country wedged between Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia that most people couldn't locate on a map if their lives depended on it. Which is unfortunate because Malawi contains one of Africa's Great Lakes, survived one of its strangest dictatorships, and somehow manages to be called the warm heart of Africa despite having endured approximately everything history could throw at it. We're talking slave trade horrors, colonial exploitation, a life president who banned bell-bottoms, and a democracy that actually annulled a rigged election and made it stick. This is roughly 12,000 years of human history compressed into a space barely 100 miles wide, and tonight we're walking through all of it. Drop a comment with where you're listening from, especially if you're one of the 3 people outside Malawi who already knew where Malawi was. And if you want more deep dives into countries you've definitely never heard of but absolutely should have, hit subscribe. We've got 193 of these to get through. Alright, let's talk about Malawi. Chapter 1: Geographic Foundation and the Great Rift. Welcome to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're exploring Malawi, a slender nation cradled in the arms of the East African Rift Valley, like a sleeping cat that somehow managed to claim an entire lake as its personal water bowl. If you've ever looked at a map of Africa and noticed what appears to be a vertical bookmark wedged between Tanzania, Mozambique, and Zambia, congratulations, you've found Malawi, a country that took long and narrow as a design philosophy and ran with it for about 900 kilometers. Let's begin where all good geographic stories begin, with catastrophic planetary violence that happened millions of years ago and created something beautiful. Malawi exists because the Earth decided to have a bit of a stretch roughly 10 to 15 million years ago, creating the East African Rift System, a massive crack in the continental crust that runs from Mozambique all the way up to the Red Sea. Think of it as the planet's version of overdoing it at yoga class, except instead of pulling a muscle, Africa pulled itself apart and created a series of spectacular valleys, escarpments, and lakes. The Malawi section of this rift is particularly dramatic, and sitting right in the middle of this geological masterpiece is Lake Malawi, which the locals sometimes call Lake Nyasa, because apparently one name wasn't enough for something this impressive. Lake Malawi is genuinely one of Earth's most remarkable bodies of water, and I'm not just saying that because I need to fill time while you drift off to sleep. This is the 3rd largest lake in Africa and the 9th largest in the world, stretching about 580 kilometers from north to south. To put that in perspective, if Lake Malawi were a country, it would be longer than some actual countries. The lake is so large it creates its own weather patterns, so deep that its bottom plunges to over 700 meters in places, and so old that it's had millions of years to become what scientists call an evolutionary playground. We'll get to the fish later, but trust me, the fish situation here is absolutely wild. The lake doesn't just dominate Malawi's geography, it practically defines it. Malawi is shaped like an exclamation point that got stretched out during a particularly aggressive game of taffy pulling, measuring roughly 900 kilometers from north to south, but only 90 to 160 kilometers from east to west at its widest points. About 1/5 of the country's total area is water, which means Malawi has more lake per square kilometre than most landlocked countries have any right to possess. The lake forms almost the entire eastern border, creating hundreds of kilometres of shoreline with sandy beaches that look suspiciously like ocean coastlines, except there's another country visible on the opposite shore, which somewhat ruins the tropical island fantasy. Now, Malawi isn't just a lake with some land attached to it, though it sometimes seems that way. The topography here is remarkably diverse for such a relatively small country, ranging from the low-lying lakeshore areas sitting at around 500 metres above sea level to the magnificent Mulanje Massif in the south, where Sapitwa Peak reaches 3,002 metres into the sky. That's quite a vertical range for a country you could drive across in a few hours. Assuming the roads cooperate and you don't get distracted by the scenery, which is unlikely because the scenery is genuinely distracting. The landscape of Malawi can be roughly divided into three main topographic regions, each with its own personality. First, there's the Rift Valley floor, which includes the lake itself and the low-lying plains along its shores. This is where most Malawians live, partly because water is right there, and partly because trying to farm on a cliff face is generally considered poor planning. The valley floor is warm, sometimes sweltering, and supports the bulk of the country's agriculture and population centres. Cities like Mangochi and Kota cling to the lakeshore, where fishermen have been pulling dinner out of the water for centuries, and probably complaining about declining fish stocks for almost as long. The second region consists of the plateau areas that rise up from the valley floor like enormous natural staircases. The Nyika Plateau in the north is particularly spectacular, a rolling highland wilderness sitting at around 2,300 metres, covered in montane grasslands that look like they were borrowed from Scotland and accidentally installed in Central Africa. During the rainy season, this plateau transforms into a wildflower display so extravagant that it seems like nature is showing off. The Zomba Plateau, closer to the south, rises dramatically from the surrounding plains like a massive natural fortress, its forested slopes and misty peaks creating a climate so different from the lowlands that you need to pack different clothes for the same day trip. The third topographic region includes the true highlands and mountain ranges, and this is where Malawi really flexes its geological muscles. The Mulanje Massif, which I mentioned earlier, is an enormous block of granite that towers over the southern region like a magnificent natural cathedral. Local legend holds that it's the home of spirits, which seems entirely reasonable when you're standing at its base watching clouds swirl around its peaks. The massif is large enough to have its own ecosystem, complete with unique plant species found nowhere else on Earth, because when you're a mountain, you can apparently just decide to invent your own flora. Climate-wise, Malawi enjoys what meteorologists politely call subtropical, and what residents might describe as mostly pleasant, with a side of extremely wet or extremely dry depending on the time of year. The country experiences three distinct seasons: a cool, dry season from May to August when temperatures are genuinely lovely, a hot, dry season from September to November when everything gets progressively warmer and everyone starts looking at the sky hopefully, and a warm, wet season from November to April when the rains arrive and transform the landscape from brown to green with impressive speed. The rainfall pattern is crucial to understanding Malawi's geography, and by extension, its history and economy. The country receives most of its annual precipitation during those summer months, with amounts varying dramatically based on elevation and topography. The highlands can receive over 2,500 millimetres of rain annually, while some lowland areas might only get half that. This variability has shaped everything from settlement patterns to agricultural practices to the timing of historical events, because generals and farmers alike have learned not to plan major activities during the rainy season unless absolutely necessary. Lake Malawi's influence on local climate cannot be overstated. The massive body of water acts as a giant temperature regulator, keeping lakeside areas warmer in winter and cooler in summer than inland regions. It also generates its own weather phenomena, including spectacular storms that can appear with alarming speed, transforming calm waters into churning chaos within minutes. Fishermen have learned to read the sky and the lake's mood with the expertise of people whose lives depend on not being caught in open water when the weather turns nasty. Now we must address the fish situation, because Lake Malawi is essentially a gigantic aquarium containing one of the most spectacular examples of evolution in action anywhere on Earth. The lake is home to more species of fish than any other lake in the world, with estimates ranging from 800 to over 1,000 species, depending on which ichthyologist you ask and how they're defining species that particular week. The vast majority of these are cichlids, a family of fish that arrived in Lake Malawi sometime in the distant past and decided to diversify into every conceivable ecological niche like an overachieving biology textbook. These cichlids have evolved into a bewildering array of forms, colours and behaviours. Some graze on algae growing on rocks, some hunt other fish, some sift through sand for tiny invertebrates, and some have developed the Piscine equivalent of specialised professions that would require detailed explanation and possibly diagrams. Many of these species are found nowhere else on Earth, making Lake Malawi one of those rare places where evolution is still actively writing new chapters while we watch. Aquarium enthusiasts worldwide pay significant amounts of money for fish that Malawian children see every day, which must be a peculiar sort of reverse culture shock. Beyond fish, Malawi's biodiversity includes healthy populations of hippos and crocodiles in and around the lake and river systems, though the two species have worked out an understanding that mostly involves staying out of each other's way. The highlands support remnant populations of larger mammals, including leopards, though these are increasingly rare. Elephants still roam some of the protected areas, particularly in the northern regions, though their numbers have fluctuated dramatically over the decades based on conservation efforts and, unfortunately, poaching pressures. The vegetation zones of Malawi read like a botanical catalogue of adaptation. Down at the lakeshore, you find tropical species comfortable with heat and humidity. Move up into the plateau regions, and the vegetation shifts to Mayombo woodland, a distinctive Central African ecosystem dominated by species that have evolved to handle the region's dramatic wet-dry seasonal rhythm. Climb higher still to the mountain peaks, and you encounter Afromontane forests and grasslands where trees grow twisted and wind-bent, creating landscapes that look distinctly un-African to the untrained eye. Water resources beyond the lake itself are abundant in most regions. The Shire River drains Lake Malawi at its southern end, flowing through the Shire Valley before eventually joining the Zambezi River in Mozambique. This drainage system is crucial to understanding both Malawi's geography and its economic potential, as the Shire River has powered hydroelectric stations and provided water for irrigation, though it's also proven frustratingly variable in flow, sometimes dropping to levels that threaten power generation and sometimes flooding with enthusiasm during particularly wet years. The geological foundation of Malawi is a complex mixture of ancient basement rocks, volcanic remnants, and sedimentary deposits that tell a story of continental drift, volcanic activity, and millions of years of erosion and deposition. The Mulanje Massif is composed of granite that cooled from molten rock deep underground before being exposed by erosion, a process that took millions of years and created stones so durable that it's been quarried for building material. The Zomba Plateau shows similar geological origins, while the Nika Plateau sits on basement complex rocks that are among the oldest on the continent. Soil quality varies dramatically across the country, shaped by the underlying geology, elevation, and rainfall patterns. The volcanic soils in some regions are remarkably fertile, supporting intensive agriculture, while other areas struggle with thin, leached soils that require careful management to remain productive. This variation has influenced settlement patterns throughout history, with the most fertile areas naturally attracting denser populations and more intensive cultivation. Natural resources include more than just fertile soil and abundant water. Malawi has deposits of various minerals, including limestone, coal, and gemstones, though these have been exploited to varying degrees throughout history. The real wealth, however, has always been the land itself and the lake resources that have supported human populations for millennia and continue to provide livelihoods for millions of Malawians today. This geographic setting, a narrow, elongated country dominated by a massive lake, featuring dramatic topographic variation within short distances, blessed with generally adequate rainfall but vulnerable to droughts, and positioned at a crossroads of Central and East African ecological zones, has shaped everything that follows in Malawi's story. The geography determined where people settled, how they made their living, which trade routes developed, and even how colonial powers eventually carved up the region. Understanding this landscape is essential to understanding the human history that unfolded upon it, which is exactly where we'll turn our attention next. After you've had a moment to envision this remarkable country stretching out beneath the stars, its great lake gleaming in the darkness like a massive mirror reflecting the African sky. Chapter 2: Ancient Peoples to Maravi Kingdom. Before there were nations or maps, there were humans living along Lake Malawi's shores for over 50,000 years, making tools here while woolly mammoths still roamed Europe. These weren't primitive cave dwellers, but sophisticated hunter-gatherers who understood their environment intimately. The earliest known inhabitants, dating from around 8000 to 2000 BCE, showed physical characteristics similar to San peoples of southern Africa. They lived in mobile groups, following seasonal patterns of game and plant availability, leaving behind increasingly sophisticated stone tools and environmental knowledge that modern GPS users still can't quite match. Between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, Bantu-speaking peoples began arriving, part of one of Africa's most significant migrations. This wasn't sudden conquest, but a gradual process spanning centuries. The Bantu brought revolutionary technologies, ironworking and systematic agriculture. Iron tools proved vastly superior to stone for clearing land, building structures, and creating weapons, allowing more productive agriculture, larger populations, and more complex societies. The identity of these early inhabitants remains somewhat mysterious, filtered through oral traditions associating names like Kalimanjira, Katanga, and Zimba with these founding populations. Slash-and-burn agriculture effectively cleared forest for farmland in this fertile region. The Bantu planted millet and sorghum, establishing permanent villages instead of constant movement. This sedentary life allowed accumulation of possessions, specialized crafts, and social hierarchies impossible when everything needed to be carried. It also required property rights, inheritance systems, and conflict resolution mechanisms, which is when politics got interesting. These early Bantu groups established the foundational settlement patterns and agricultural systems supporting all subsequent developments. Based on genetic evidence, they largely replaced or absorbed earlier San-related populations, though with less genetic mixing than occurred further south where Bantu and Khoisan peoples extensively intermarried. By the 13th century, another Bantu wave reached Lake Malawi. These newcomers, the Maravi peoples, arrived from the Congo Basin near Lake Mweru, part of the influential Luba Kingdom area. The Luba were renowned for sophisticated political systems and sacred kingship concepts that would profoundly influence Maravi structures. This wasn't just a migration of people, but a transfer of political philosophy, emphasizing centralized authority balanced with ritual power and complex succession systems. The Maravi migration unfolded over 2 or 3 centuries, with oral traditions speaking of stops, disputes, and reconciliations along the journey. One tradition mentions a place called Choma, which might refer to a river in Zambia, a mountain in northern Malawi thought to contain a Kalonga's burial site, or a location in southern Zambia. The ambiguity frustrates historians but is typical of oral traditions prioritizing mythic significance over precise geographic detail. Several important clans shaped the political destiny. The Banda clan, arriving first, became associated with religious authority, healing, metallurgy, and the mysterious knowledge pre-modern societies attributed to those working with fire and minerals. The Fiery clan brought kingship concepts and would provide the ruling Kalonga. The Mwale and Nkoma clans also played significant roles. This created a complex system where different clans held different types of power, creating mutual dependence that theoretically prevented any single group from total domination, though power struggles remained inevitable. The Maravi settled southwest of Lake Malawi, in an area offering ideal combinations of agricultural land, water access and defensible positions. Archaeological excavations at Mankamba near modern Salima reveal occupation from the 12th century, with clear Maravi presence by mid-15th century. The finds are remarkable. Indian glass beads, 31 shards of Ming Chinese porcelain, worked ivory, and copper, imported from at least 570 kilometers away. This was a sophisticated trading center connected to Indian Ocean commercial networks. Around 1480, the Maravi established the Maravi Confederacy, a centralized political system that would dominate the region for the next 2 centuries. The Confederacy was ruled by the Kalonga from the administrative capital of Manthimba, while the Makewana religious leader controlled rituals from Mankamba. This dual capital system balanced secular and sacred power. The succession system prevented father-to-son inheritance. Instead, succession passed through the Nyangu, Kalonga's sister or mother, to her sons, meaning the Kalonga's own sons could never succeed him. This maintained clan unity brilliantly, until it eventually created the succession disputes that would tear the Confederacy apart. The Maravi expanded through military conquest, diplomatic marriages, and strategic placement of subordinate chiefs. The Kalonga sent relatives to establish new settlements and extend Maravi influence, granting them iron stools and regalia marking legitimate authority. This created an extensive network of chiefs owing allegiance to the Kalonga while maintaining significant territorial autonomy. The economic foundation rested on agriculture, millet, sorghum, livestock, and especially the ivory trade connecting interior Africa to Indian Ocean networks. Elephants were abundant, ivory highly valued from China to Arabia to Europe. The Maravi controlled access to major elephant populations and routes to the coast, positioning themselves as essential intermediaries in a lucrative network. Lake Malawi functioned as a trade highway, with dugout canoes moving goods efficiently across the water rather than struggling through difficult terrain overland. Lakeshore areas became trading centres where interior goods accumulated before transport to the Mozambique coast. Places like Nkotakota would later become major hubs, though during the Maravi period the trade was primarily in ivory and iron, rather than the human cargo that would later devastate the region. The Maravi traded primarily through Swahili Arab merchant intermediaries who had been active since at least the 13th century, connecting interior Africa to vast commercial systems linking East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The Maravi imported Indian glass beads, Chinese porcelain, copper from Katanga, and various manufactured goods. The beads functioned as currency and status markers, with certain types restricted to royalty. Ming porcelain at Mankamba proves Malawi was part of truly global trade networks centuries before European colonization. The Confederacy peaked in the 17th century under Kalonga Musura, reigned approximately 1600 to 1650. By 1635, Musura had extended Maravi influence from the Zambezi River to the Dwangwa River, west to the Luangwa, and east nearly to the Mozambique coast, enormous territory encompassing parts of modern Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique. The Maravi maintained authority through military power, trade control, and religious legitimacy via the Makawanas' network of shrines and rainmaking ceremonies. One of the most important Maravi religious institutions was the Mlira ceremony, which brought representatives from throughout the Confederacy to the capital to venerate the spirit of the founding Kalonga. This wasn't just religious theatre, it was a political gathering where subordinate chiefs renewed their allegiance, disputes were mediated, and the unity of the Confederacy was ritually reinforced. The ceremony also provided crucial opportunities for trade, marriage negotiations, and the kind of political networking that keeps large structures functioning. Skip a few of these ceremonies, and the bonds holding the Confederacy together started to weaken. The Maravi also practiced the Niao secret society traditions, which continue among Chewa peoples today and were recognized by UNESCO as intangible cultural heritage in 2005. The Niao involved mass dances and rituals that marked important life transitions and maintained cultural continuity across generations. These weren't frivolous entertainments, but essential mechanisms for transmitting cultural values, maintaining social cohesion, and connecting the living community with ancestral spirits. The masks and dances depicted animals, spirits, and moral lessons, creating a symbolic language that reinforced cultural identity and social norms. Portuguese contact with the Maravi began in the 16th century, when Portuguese traders and explorers pushing inland from the Mozambique coast encountered this powerful interior kingdom. The first detailed Portuguese account came from Gaspar Bocaro, who travelled through Maravi territory in 1616 and described a strong, economically active state controlling vast territories. Later accounts from the 1660s painted pictures of a confederacy at its height, commanding respect from neighbours and trading partners alike. The relationship between Maravi and Portuguese was complex. Kalonga Musura occasionally allied with Portuguese forces, providing warriors to help suppress rebellions in exchange for trade access and possibly firearms. At other times, the Maravi clashed with Portuguese interests or allied with groups resisting Portuguese expansion. This wasn't inconsistent but strategic flexibility, the Maravi pursuing their interests in a rapidly changing landscape where new players and technologies reshaped regional power dynamics. The Portuguese brought guns, changing warfare significantly, though the Maravi quickly adapted and incorporated firearms into their own military strategies. Yet even at its height, the Confederacy contained seeds of its own fragmentation. The succession system, designed to prevent hereditary monarchy, created ongoing uncertainty about who would become the next Kalonga. When strong leaders died, multiple legitimate candidates might emerge, each backed by different factions. The Confederacy's size meant distant subordinate chiefs had significant autonomy and might see opportunities to break away during succession disputes. And wealth from trade created economic interests, sometimes conflicting with political unity, as individual chiefs discovered they could trade directly with coastal merchants without going through the Kalonga's intermediaries. The 18th century saw the beginning of the Confederacy's decline. Succession disputes became more frequent and destructive. After Undi, a relative of the Kalonga, left Mankamba following a succession dispute and took the Nyangu with him, the system for nominating successors broke down. Without Nyangu present at Mankamba, local councillors from the Banda clan began nominating successors, which worked until it didn't. Oral traditions describe the succession system becoming open to manipulation, with people who weren't even from the Feri clan aspiring to become Kalonga, previously unthinkable. By 1720, the Confederacy had fragmented into several autonomous factions. Individual chiefs who had grown wealthy from trade saw less reason to submit to a distant Kalonga whose authority was increasingly theoretical. The rise of the Yao people as formidable long-distance traders created competition for routes and resources. On the horizon, though the Maravi couldn't have known it, were two developments that would fundamentally reshape the region: the intensification of the slave trade and the arrival of new groups fleeing upheavals in southern Africa. What the Maravi had accomplished during their centuries of dominance was remarkable. They had created a political structure that united diverse peoples across a vast territory through a combination of kinship, trade, military power, and religious authority. They had developed sophisticated economic networks connecting interior Africa to global trade systems. They had maintained cultural traditions that would survive the Confederacy's political fragmentation, continuing among Chewa and Nyanja peoples to this day. The name Malawi itself derives from Maravi, possibly meaning flames, perhaps referring to the iron-working fires that were so central to Maravi technology and economy, or perhaps to the shimmering appearance of the lake waters that first attracted Maravi migrants to the region. The Maravi period demonstrated what African societies could achieve through political innovation and economic engagement before the destructive impacts of the slave trade and colonial conquest. This wasn't a primitive society waiting to be civilized. It was a complex polity with sophisticated governance systems, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural traditions. The archaeological evidence at Mankamba proves the Maravi were connected to global trade networks, importing Chinese porcelain and Indian beads, exporting ivory that might end up in India, China, or Arabia. They had figured out how to manage a multi-ethnic confederacy across difficult terrain using a combination of force, diplomacy, and shared ritual that kept the whole structure functioning for centuries. The legacy of the Maravi period extends far beyond political history. The Chichewa language, spoken by millions across Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique, emerged from the Maravi Empire. The matrilineal kinship systems that continue to characterize many central Malawian societies trace back to Maravi traditions. The Nyao ceremonies and masked dances that remain central to Chewa cultural identity are direct descendants of Maravi religious practices. Even the country's name preserves the memory of this pre-colonial kingdom, a reminder that Malawi's history extends back centuries before European contact, and that the people of the region had built impressive civilizations long before colonizers arrived, claiming to bring civilization with them. Chapter 3: Slave Trade and Livingstone's Arrival. The 18th century's close brought catastrophe. Between 1790 and 1860, the slave trade intensified to industrial-scale horror, devastating communities and shattering political structures. The fragmented Maravi Confederacy, already weakened by succession disputes, found itself completely unprepared. Demand for enslaved people on Africa's east coast grew steadily, driven by expanding clove plantations on Zanzibar and Pemba, date plantations in Oman, and markets across Arabia and the Persian Gulf. By mid-19th century, between 80,000 and 100,000 Africans were being killed or enslaved annually. Zanzibar's slave market alone handled 40,000 people per year, swelling to possibly 70,000 by the 1860s. These were individuals with names, families, dreams, all reduced to commodities. Swahili Arab traders from the coast pushed inland seeking ivory and human captives. Lake Malawi became a critical corridor, functioning as a highway for slave dhows. Lakeshore settlements at Nkhotakota, Karonga, Salima, and Mangochi transformed into collection points where enslaved people were assembled before the terrible journey to the coast. The Yao people became central players. Originally from northern Mozambique, they had been 18th century ivory trade middlemen. They migrated into southern Malawi from the 1830s onward. When severe famine struck in the early 1860s, and with Chewa structures weakened, the Yao transitioned from trading ivory to trading human beings. The Yao possessed several advantages. They had firearms from coastal trade, giving overwhelming military superiority. They understood Swahili culture and language, making them ideal intermediaries. And they converted to Islam in the 1870s and 80s, cementing relationships with Swahili Arab traders. Conversion brought literacy, as scribes and sheikhs established themselves at Yao chiefs' courts, introducing madrasas and mosques. The Jumbe dynasty of Swahili Arab trader chiefs arrived at Nkhotakota around 1840. At the height of his power, the Jumbe transported between 5,000 and 20,000 enslaved people through Nkhotakota annually, making it one of East Africa's most significant slave trading centres. The mechanics were brutal. Raiding parties attacked villages at dawn. Young people were primary targets. The elderly and infirm were killed or left to die. Villages were burned, food destroyed. Communities lived in constant fear, unable to plant crops far from fortified positions. Captured people were brought to collection points and sold like livestock. From lakeshore centres they were crammed into dhows. The crossing was hazardous. Overloaded vessels sometimes capsized. On the eastern shore, the enslaved were chained together using wooden yokes called gori, or bound by iron collars. Many were forced to carry elephant tusks. The march across Mozambique covered hundreds of miles. Anyone too weak was abandoned to die. The path was marked by bones, a trail of suffering stretching from Lake Malawi to the Indian Ocean. At the coast, survivors faced another sea voyage to Zanzibar. Mortality was horrific at every stage. For every person reaching Zanzibar's slave market, several died along the way. Survivors faced lifetimes of forced labour on plantations, as domestic servants, or in various capacities across the Indian Ocean world, sometimes as far as India, the Persian Gulf, or Ottoman territories. While the Yao dominated slave trading in southern Malawi, the north and centre faced different but equally devastating disruptions from the Ngoni. The Ngoni were refugees themselves, fleeing the Mfekan, the Great Scattering or Crushing, the period of upheaval and warfare in southern Africa in the early 19th century, associated with the rise of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. The Ngoni weren't fleeing slavery, they were fleeing other African armies and the consolidation of power that made their own positions untenable. But the violence they brought with them added another layer of catastrophe to Malawi's already dire situation. Zwangendaba Gumbi, the Ngoni leader, had served under Zweid of the Ndwandwe kingdom before Shaka's Zulu forces defeated them at the Battle of Umhlathuze River in 1819. Zwangendaba gathered his clan and various refugees and began a remarkable migration that would eventually cover over 1,000 miles and last more than 2 decades. They moved north through Mozambique and Zimbabwe, adopting Shaka's revolutionary military tactics based on age regiment organisation and the short stabbing spear, while also incorporating captured people into their ranks. This made them a growing rather than diminishing force during their migration. Every victory added warriors to their regiments. The Ngoni crossed the Zambezi River on November 20th, 1835, during a total solar eclipse. Oral tradition remembers this dramatically, with some accounts claiming the waters parted for Zwangendaba, though historians note this is likely mythologized memory combined with the reality of crossing during an extraordinary celestial event that would have terrified people on both sides. The eclipse became a powerful element in Ngoni identity, marking their passage into new lands. Many Ngoni reportedly drowned during the crossing, adding traumatic significance to collective memory. Zwangendaba led his people through Malawi, raiding as they went, eventually reaching Lake Tanganyika's western shore in Tanzania, where he established his capital at Maputo, which means dreams, around 1842. He died there around 1848, and the succession disputes that followed split the Ngoni into multiple factions. Some groups moved back south into Malawi, settling primarily in the central region around Nchu and Dedza, the Maseko Ngoni, and in the north around Mzimba, followers of Mbelwa, Zwangendaba's son. These returning groups brought Zulu military organisation and a warrior culture that made them formidable adversaries for weakened Chewa and other peoples they encountered. The Ngoni's impact on Malawi was complex and lasting. They didn't primarily engage in slave trading themselves, though some groups occasionally sold captives to Arab traders. Instead, they raided for cattle, food and people to incorporate into their own society. Young men were inducted into Ngoni age regiments, essentially conscripted into the army. Women were taken as wives, and over time, intermarriage between Ngoni and local peoples created hybrid communities. The Ngoni brought their language, though it would eventually be lost except in ritual contexts, replaced by Tumbuka in the north and Nyanja in the centre. But they retained strong cultural traditions, including the Ngoma war dance and social structures emphasising hierarchy and military discipline. The combined effect of Yao slave raiding and Ngoni military incursions was catastrophic for remaining Maravi populations and other communities. The Chewa, descendants of the Maravi Confederacy, found themselves attacked from multiple directions. In the south, Yao raiders targeted them for the slave trade. In the centre and north, Ngoni impirs descended on villages to seize cattle, food, and captives. The Ngoni and Yao also fought each other periodically, creating a three-way conflict that left ordinary people caught in the middle with no safe options. Some Chewa chiefs saved themselves by creating alliances with Swahili traders or by submitting to Ngoni or Yao authority, but this meant becoming participants in the very systems destroying their own people. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas. People couldn't plant crops in outlying fields when raids might come at any moment. They couldn't engage in long-distance trade when routes were controlled by slave raiders. They fled to mountain refuges, inaccessible swamps, or the protection of whatever armed group seemed least likely to enslave them. The Mwaze Kasungu chiefdom in central Malawi managed to maintain some independence by controlling key trade routes and playing diplomatic games with various factions. But this was the exception. Most communities simply tried to survive, which meant accepting subordinate positions in new political arrangements dominated by either Yao or Ngoni leadership. Into this maelstrom walked David Livingstone on September 16th. 1859. The Scottish missionary and explorer had been sent by the British government on the Zambezi expedition, ostensibly to explore the Zambezi River's navigability to promote legitimate trade as an alternative to slavery. When the Zambezi proved unnavigable due to rapids, Livingstone turned his attention to the Shire River, a tributary flowing south from Lake Malawi. Following the Shire northward, he and his party, including botanist John Kirk, discovered Lake Shirwa and finally reached Lake Malawi's southern shores, which Livingstone named Lake Nyasa, apparently not realizing that Nyasa simply meant lake in the local language, making it Lake Lake, which is charmingly redundant. Livingstone was struck by Lake Malawi's beauty, later calling it the Lake of Stars because of the way lantern lights from fishing boats at night resembled stars reflected on the water. But he was equally struck by the horrors of the slave trade he witnessed. Throughout his journeys in the region, he encountered slave caravans, burned villages, and starving refugees. He saw corpses left floating in the Shire River after Chikunda slave hunters working for Portuguese traders had raided communities. He witnessed the deliberate destruction of food supplies to create famine conditions that made people more vulnerable to enslavement. These experiences transformed Livingstone from an explorer focused on geography into a passionate abolitionist whose writings and speeches would help mobilize British public opinion against the East African slave trade. Livingstone's vision was captured in his famous formulation of bringing Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Africa. This sounds appallingly paternalistic to modern ears, reflecting Victorian assumptions about European superiority and the need to civilize supposedly backward peoples. But in the 1860s context, when the slave trade was decimating populations, Livingstone genuinely believed he was offering an alternative economic system. If Africans could produce cash crops and trade them legitimately with Europe, he reasoned, they wouldn't need to engage in the slave trade. Christian missionaries would provide education and moral guidance. European commerce would create economic opportunities, and civilization would follow naturally. The massive flaws in this logic, particularly the assumption that African societies weren't already civilized, somehow escaped him, though Livingstone had more respect for African capabilities than many contemporaries. The Zambezi expedition itself was largely a failure by its own stated objectives. The expedition lasted until 1863, plagued by friction among European members, illness, and practical difficulties. Livingstone's leadership abilities, legendary in his earlier solo journeys, proved inadequate for managing a diverse group. His brother Charles was particularly difficult, and artist Thomas Baines was dismissed under controversial circumstances. The paddle steamer Ma Robert proved unsuitable for the rivers, constantly breaking down or running aground. Livingstone's wife Mary joined the expedition in 1862, only to die from malaria within months, adding personal tragedy to professional frustration. The government eventually recalled the expedition in 1863, considering it an expensive disappointment. Yet the Zambezi expedition's long-term impacts far exceeded its immediate failures. Livingstone and Kirk had documented Lake Malawi and the surrounding regions, providing the first detailed European maps and accounts of the area. More importantly, Livingstone's writings about the slave trade he witnessed, particularly after returning to Britain, created a moral imperative for British intervention. His descriptions of slave caravans and the devastation of communities resonated with the British public, who had already successfully pressured their government to end the Atlantic slave trade and were looking for new causes. The association of Lake Malawi with Livingstone's name would prove crucial for later British colonisation efforts, providing both geographic knowledge and moral justification for establishing control. Following Livingstone, Scottish missionaries began arriving in Malawi in the 1860s and 70s, establishing mission stations that would become centres of Christian influence and Western education. The Free Church of Scotland founded the Livingstonia Mission in 1875, named in Livingstone's honour after his death in 1873. The established Church of Scotland arrived in 1876 and founded Blantyre Mission, named after Livingstone's Scottish birthplace. These missions provided education, medical care and religious instruction, but they also became nodes in a growing network of European influence that would eventually lead to formal British colonisation. The missionaries genuinely opposed slavery and sometimes sheltered refugees from slave raids, but their presence also facilitated the cultural and economic penetration that colonial conquest would complete. The period from 1790 to 1870 represents perhaps the darkest chapter in Malawi's history. Decades when the slave trade and associated violence killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced countless others, destroyed traditional political structures, and created conditions of almost constant warfare and insecurity. The old Maravi order had collapsed. New political formations dominated by Yao and Ngoni leaders had emerged, but these were based substantially on extraction and violence, rather than the agricultural production and long-distance trade that had characterized earlier societies. The arrival of Livingstone and the missionaries marked the beginning of yet another transformation, this time toward European colonization that would claim to end the slave trade while establishing its own forms of exploitation and control. The people of Malawi had survived a catastrophe, only to discover that their struggles were far from over. Chapter 4: Colonial Era. The transition from missionary presence to formal British colonisation happened with remarkable speed once the decision was made. In 1889, Britain proclaimed a protectorate over the Shire Highlands, the area where Scottish missionaries had established their stations and where European settlers had begun acquiring land. This was extended on May 14, 1891, to encompass the entire territory west of Lake Malawi, initially called the Nyasaland Districts Protectorate. The name derived from Nyasa, Livingstone's name for the lake, making the territory essentially Lakeland, which lacked imagination but at least was straightforward. Harry Hamilton Johnston arrived as Britain's first Commissioner and Consul General on July 16, 1891, charged with establishing effective British control over a territory the government had claimed but didn't actually administer. Johnston was an interesting character. Explorer, botanist, artist, linguist, and colonial administrator who spoke multiple African languages and would eventually publish 40 books on African subjects. He was also funded partially by Cecil Rhodes, the mining magnate and arch-imperialist, who contributed £10,000 annually toward administering the protectorate. Rhodes wanted to extend British South Africa Company control north of the Zambezi, but Scottish missionaries successfully lobbied to keep Nyasaland under Foreign Office administration rather than company rule. Johnston served both as the protectorate's commissioner and as administrator of Rhodes's territories to the west, creating a complicated arrangement that lasted until 1900. When Johnston arrived, he controlled almost nothing. The British protectorate existed on paper and in a few mission stations, but vast areas remained under the authority of Yao slave-trading chiefs, Ngoni military leaders, or independent Choa chieftains who had no interest in British rule. Johnston spent the next several years conducting military campaigns to impose British control, a process euphemistically called pacification, but which involved actual warfare against groups resisting conquest. He was provided with a small force of Indian troops in 1891 and began training African soldiers and police to supplement them. Johnston's primary targets were the Yao chiefs who controlled the slave trade routes. The moral justification for British intervention had been ending the slave trade, so attacking slave traders made perfect propaganda sense while also eliminating political rivals to British authority. The campaigns were brutal but effective. By the mid-1890s, Johnston had defeated the major Yao chieftains, destroyed the Jumbe's power at Nkota, and established British control over the slave trade routes. The trade didn't end immediately. It continued in reduced form until around 1900, but British authority was established. Alfred Sharp, Johnston's deputy and successor, completed the pacification process by the end of the century, extending British control to the Northern Territories and defeating remaining pockets of resistance. Having established control, the British faced the question of what to do with their new territory. Nyasaland had few obvious resources and limited immediate economic value. It wasn't like northern Rhodesia with its copper mines or southern Rhodesia with its gold and good agricultural land. What Nyasaland offered was potentially productive farmland, particularly in the Shire Highlands, and an African population that could provide labour. The colonial economy would be built on these foundations: European-owned estates producing cash crops, and African labour making it profitable. Even before the protectorate was formally proclaimed, European companies and individuals had made or claimed to have made treaties with local chiefs supposedly transferring land to European ownership. The African Lakes Company claimed over 2.75 million acres. Alexander Lowe Bruce, David Livingstone's son-in-law, claimed 176,000 acres. Eugene Sharrer claimed 363,000 acres. John Buchanan and his brothers claimed another 167,000 acres. These lands were purchased for trivial quantities of goods under agreements signed by chiefs with absolutely no understanding of English concepts of private property and land tenure. In African customary systems, land belonged to communities and was held in trust by chiefs for their people. Individuals and families had use rights to specific plots, but these were contingent on continued use and membership in the community. Land couldn't be permanently alienated or sold in the European sense. When chiefs signed treaties or accepted goods, they thought they were entering into reciprocal relationships or granting temporary use rights, not permanently transferring ownership. They certainly didn't understand that accepting a few bolts of cloth and some trade goods meant surrendering sovereignty over vast territories forever. The colonial administration recognized these transactions as valid, consolidating much of the most fertile land in the Shire Highlands in European hands. Existing African villages and farms were theoretically exempted from these sales, and villagers were told their homes and fields weren't being alienated. But the concentration of fertile land under European ownership created profound economic consequences that lasted throughout the colonial period and beyond. Africans were pushed onto less fertile crown lands or remained on European estates as tenants, subject to whatever terms the landlords imposed. This brought the thangata system, which would become synonymous with Nyasaland's colonial exploitation. In pre-colonial times, thangata had meant reciprocal labour villagers would work in their chief's gardens for a defined period, often rewarded with food or beer, in exchange for the chief's protection and governance. It was a voluntary social institution embedded in customary relationships. Under colonialism, thangata transformed into something entirely different: forced labour in lieu of rent. European estate owners required African tenants to provide labour as payment for occupying land. Initially, this meant 2 months per year per adult male, 1 month for rent, another month to earn money for the hut tax the colonial government imposed. But on many estates, particularly those growing cotton or tobacco, the obligations expanded to 4, 5, or even 6 months annually. This labour was demanded during the crucial growing season, when tenants needed to work their own fields to grow food for their families. The result was predictable. Tenants couldn't produce enough food, leading to malnutrition, vulnerability to famine, and dependence on buying food with wages that were either non-existent or inadequate. The system was brutal in practice. On the AL, Bruce Estates at Magamero, run by Alexander Livingstone Bruce, David Livingstone's grandson, ironically, workers were subjected to violent coercion, had wages withheld, and were forced to work extended hours to ensure sufficient labour was available throughout the cotton growing season. William Jervis Livingstone, the estate manager, became notorious for his harsh treatment of tenants. In 1915, this exploitation contributed to an uprising led by John Chilembwe, an African minister educated in the United States, who had watched the brutality of estate labour with growing anger. The rebellion was quickly crushed. Chilembwe was killed, and 3 European estate employees died, including Livingstone. But the uprising revealed the depths of African resentment toward the thangata system. The colonial government's response was telling. Although officials recognized that estate conditions were appalling, the Natives on Private Estates Ordinance of 1928 simply formalized thangata rather than abolishing it. Landlords could now choose to receive rent in cash, in fixed quantities of tobacco or other crops, or through direct labour. This seemed like progress but merely legitimized exploitation. Tenants growing tobacco or cotton to pay rent in kind were often paid below market rates or had the market rate manipulated by estate owners who controlled local prices. Direct labour thangata continued on tea estates that required hands-on work rather than crop production. The broader colonial economy was organised to extract value from African labour while providing minimal investment in African welfare. Nyasaland became known as the imperial slum, a term that perfectly captured its status as Britain's least valued and most poorly funded African possession. The Protectorate's meagre finances were drained by railway debts incurred on its behalf by the British government, which had borrowed money to build infrastructure benefiting European interests. Until the 1950s, ludicrously little was spent on social services. The Department of Education wasn't established until 1925, and even then it consisted of only a director, assistant director, 2 superintendents, and 3 clerks trying to manage education for the entire territory. With limited local employment and wages deliberately kept low, thousands of Malawians were forced to seek work as migrant labourers in the Rhodesias and South Africa. This served multiple colonial purposes. It provided cheap labour for mines and farms elsewhere while reducing pressure on Nyasaland's limited economy, and it created a population dependent on wage labour and therefore more compliant to colonial demands. But it devastated family structures, as men left for months or years at a time, leaving women and children to manage farms with inadequate labour. It also meant the strongest workers were employed enriching other territories while Nyasaland received only the money they sent home. The colonial administration itself was remarkably thin compared to other British territories. Britain governed Nyasaland on the absolute minimum of expenditure, with skeleton staff and virtually no development infrastructure. A fire in the Secretariat at Zomba in 1919 destroyed all government records, which tells you something about how seriously the Colonial Office took record-keeping in this particular territory. Before 1945, development departments could do little more than experiment, and administration was conducted with minimal resources and personnel. Cash crop production focused on tobacco, tea, and cotton. Coffee had been tried in the 1890s but couldn't compete with Brazilian production. Tobacco became the dominant export crop, though its quality varied wildly. European estate tobacco production peaked in the 1920s, but then faced competition from African smallholders who could produce tobacco more cheaply on Crown lands. By 1933, Africans were producing 72% of Nyasaland's tobacco, a shift that terrified European estate owners who had assumed they'd maintain monopoly control over cash crops. The colonial response was to regulate African tobacco production through the Native Tobacco Board, established to ostensibly maintain quality standards but actually to constrain African production and protect European estates. When Africans proved capable of producing high-quality tobacco that competed successfully with estate production, the rules changed to favour European interests. This pattern repeated across colonial economies. When Africans demonstrated capability and independence, the system adjusted to maintain European dominance. In 1953, Britain made its most catastrophic political decision regarding Nyasaland, forcing it into the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, linking it with northern and southern Rhodesia. The federation was sold as promoting economic development through integration, but everyone understood the real purpose was maintaining white settler dominance. Southern Rhodesia's white population wanted access to northern Rhodesia's copper revenues and Nyasaland's labour, while Britain hoped federation would create a viable economic unit and avoid the problem of granting majority African rule. African nationalists in all three territories bitterly opposed federation, correctly seeing it as an attempt to perpetuate colonial control under a new structure. The federation proved unpopular enough to galvanise nationalist resistance across all three territories. In Nyasaland, the Nyasaland African Congress, formed in 1944, became the vehicle for opposition. When the federation was imposed despite African protests, nationalist sentiment intensified. This created the political conditions that would eventually lead to independence, though that struggle would be the story of the next phase of Malawi's history. The colonial period had profound and lasting effects that shaped modern Malawi in ways still visible today. The concentration of land in estate ownership, the creation of a labour export economy, the minimal investment in education and infrastructure, the establishment of tobacco dependence, and the political structures that excluded African participation all created patterns that persisted long after independence. Nyasaland wasn't just poorly governed, it was deliberately organised to extract wealth while minimising investment, creating poverty that served colonial interests. The violence with which British rule was established, the brutality of the thangata system, and the systematic subordination of African interests to settler profits left deep scars. When Malawians fought for independence, they weren't just seeking self-governance. They were trying to escape a system designed to exploit them indefinitely. Chapter 5: Independence Struggle and Banda Era. The Nyasaland African Congress had existed in various forms since 1943, formed by leaders of earlier native associations who had been organising since the 1920s. These were groups of educated Africans trying to work within the colonial system to advocate for African interests, petition for reforms, and create spaces for African political expression in a system designed to exclude them. But the formation of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1953 changed everything, transforming what had been a gradualist movement into something far more radical. The Federation was a betrayal. For years, African leaders had been told that Nyasaland would eventually move towards self-government under British oversight. That partnership between the races was the goal. Then the Colonial Office joined Nyasaland with the two Rhodesias, territories dominated by white settlers who had no intention of allowing African majority rule. The Federation's real purpose was obvious: extending white minority control across all three territories while accessing northern Rhodesia's copper wealth and Nyasaland's labour pool. African opposition was fierce, but Britain imposed the Federation anyway. This galvanised the nationalist movement and created demand for stronger leadership. The NAC needed someone with unassailable credibility, education, and experience to lead the struggle. They found him practicing medicine in Ghana. Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, a Malawian who had left around 1915 and spent the next 4 decades abroad, studying in the United States, receiving his medical degree, and practicing medicine in England and Ghana. Banda had represented the NAC at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, where he met future African leaders like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah. He had lobbied against the Federation from abroad, but he hadn't been home in over 40 years. The nationalist leadership begged him to return. On July 6, 1958, Hastings Banda came home to a tumultuous welcome. He was 60 years old, educated, articulate, and absolutely uncompromising in his message. The Federation must be destroyed. His speaking tours drew massive crowds. His rhetoric electrified audiences. He toured the country delivering speeches that left colonial authorities increasingly nervous. This wasn't careful petition writing or polite requests for gradual reform. This was direct confrontation, mass mobilization, and explicit demands for African self-determination. The colonial government watched nervously as Banda's popularity grew and unrest spread. In March 1959, the authorities struck. They declared a state of emergency, arrested Banda and other nationalist leaders, banned the NAC, and launched a brutal crackdown that killed 51 Africans and detained 1,300 others. It was intended to crush the nationalist movement. Instead, it achieved the opposite. The emergency exposed the brutal reality of Federation rule to international scrutiny, transformed Banda from a political leader into a national martyr, and cleared the political field for Banda's allies to form a new, more powerful party, the Malawi Congress Party. The British had miscalculated catastrophically. The violence drew international condemnation. The British government appointed the Devlin Commission to investigate, and its report was damning, criticising police state measures and documenting overwhelming African opposition to the Federation. This led to the Monckton Commission in July 1959 to review the entire Federation structure, essentially signalling that the experiment had failed. When Banda was released from prison in April 1960, he emerged as the unchallenged leader of a unified movement with immense political leverage. Elections were held in August 1961 under universal suffrage, and the Malawi Congress Party won overwhelmingly. Banda became Minister of Natural Resources and Local Government, though he functioned as de facto Prime Minister. Constitutional conferences in London in 1962 led to Nyasaland, achieving internal self-government with Banda as Prime Minister in February 1963. In December 1962, British Secretary of State for African Affairs R.A. Butler agreed to dissolve the Federation. It officially ended in December 1963, after a decade of bitter African opposition had proven it unsustainable. Banda himself chose the name Malawi for the independent nation. He had seen it on an old French map as the name of a Lake Maravi and liked the sound and appearance of the word. It was a deliberate connection to the pre-colonial Maravi Confederacy, a claim to historical sovereignty that predated European colonization. On July 6, 1964, exactly 6 years after Banda's return to the country, Nyasaland became independent as Malawi, with Banda as Prime Minister. The struggle for independence had succeeded. What followed was far more complicated. Barely a month after independence, Malawi suffered what became known as the Cabinet Crisis of 1964. Banda had already demonstrated autocratic tendencies, making decisions without consulting his cabinet and showing little tolerance for disagreement. His ministers, many of them young intellectuals who had fought alongside him for independence, grew increasingly alarmed by his authoritarian style. They were particularly concerned about his refusal to break ties with apartheid South Africa and Portuguese-controlled Mozambique, his concentration of power, and his dismissive treatment of cabinet input. Several ministers, including Henry Chipembere and Kanyama Chiume, presented Banda with proposals designed to limit his powers and create a more democratic government structure with genuine cabinet oversight. They wanted collective leadership, not personal rule. Banda's response was immediate and ruthless. He dismissed 4 ministers outright. Others resigned in sympathy, refusing to serve in a government that operated as one-man rule. The dissidents fled the country, fearing for their lives with good reason. Henry Chipembere attempted an armed rebellion in 1965, but failed to gain traction in the countryside and eventually fled into exile. All resistance attempts would fail against Banda's growing security apparatus. The cabinet crisis revealed what Banda's rule would become. In 1966, Malawi adopted a new constitution declaring the country a republic. Banda was elected president for a 5-year term. He was the only candidate. The new constitution granted Banda wide executive and legislative powers and formally made the MCP the only legal party, though Malawi had already been a de facto one-party state since independence. The constitution effectively legalized dictatorship. In 1970, an MCP Congress declared Banda its president for life. The legislature confirmed this in 1971. Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, liberator of Malawi, had become Ngwazi, the Great Lion, life president, absolute ruler. Banda's dictatorship was thorough and peculiar. He controlled every aspect of Malawian life with meticulous attention to detail that extended far beyond normal authoritarian concerns. Anyone refusing to join the MCP faced violent persecution. Political opponents were jailed, executed, or disappeared. The Malawi Young Pioneers, a paramilitary youth organization, enforced Banda's will with brutal efficiency. Dissent was not tolerated. People learned to be careful about what they said, who they trusted, and how they behaved in public spaces. But Banda's control went beyond politics into personal behaviour. He implemented strict moral codes, reflecting his Presbyterian upbringing and Victorian sensibilities. Men had to have their hair cut short, long hair was illegal, women were forbidden from wearing trousers or skirts above the knee. Banda personally reviewed films and banned those he deemed immoral, which was most of them. Traditional dances he considered too sexual were prohibited. The dress code laws and behavioural restrictions made Banda's Malawi one of the most socially controlled states in Africa, combining political authoritarianism with moral absolutism in ways that were simultaneously repressive and absurd. Economically, Banda pursued conservative, pro-Western policies that were unusual for post-independence African leaders. While many newly independent nations embraced socialist economics, nationalised industries and Pan-African solidarity movements, Banda maintained friendly trading relations with white minority-ruled South Africa and Portuguese colonial authorities in Mozambique, to the disappointment and outrage of other African leaders. He argued these relationships were practical necessities for a landlocked country dependent on transportation routes through neighbouring territories controlled by these regimes. His critics argued he was betraying African liberation movements and anti-colonial solidarity for economic advantage and personal pragmatism. Both perspectives contained truth. Banda concentrated on building infrastructure and increasing agricultural productivity. Roads were improved, schools and hospitals built, agricultural extension services expanded. Tobacco remained the dominant export crop, and Banda's administration worked to increase production and improve quality. Estate agriculture continued much as it had under colonialism, though the thangata system was finally abolished in 1962, replaced by cash rents or wage labour. Smallholder tobacco production expanded significantly. The economy grew modestly through the 1970s and early 80s, though most Malawians remained poor and dependent on subsistence agriculture. Banda created a massive business empire, Press Holdings Limited, which controlled significant portions of Malawi's economy, including banking, insurance, transport, agriculture, and retail. Officially, these were MCP assets, but in practice Banda controlled them personally, blurring lines between state resources, party finances, and personal wealth in ways that made him extraordinarily rich, while most Malawians struggled. The concentration of economic power paralleled his political monopoly, creating a system where challenging Banda meant challenging every major institution in the country simultaneously. The personality cult around Banda was elaborate, omnipresent, and compulsory throughout Malawi. His image appeared everywhere. His pronouncements were treated as wisdom beyond question. The national anthem praised him personally. Government functions required elaborate displays of loyalty. Women danced in traditional dress at his rallies, performing choreographed celebrations of Banda's greatness. The entire performance was simultaneously genuine. Many Malawians genuinely respected Banda's education and early leadership and coerced, because failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm could have serious consequences. Yet Banda also emphasized Malawi's Chiwa heritage and traditional culture in ways that resonated with many. He promoted Chichewa language, supported traditional authorities alongside the modern state, and positioned himself as a traditional chief as well as a modern president. This cultural nationalism gave Banda's rule a legitimacy beyond mere coercion, connecting it to pre-colonial political traditions, even while operating a thoroughly modern authoritarian state. The international community's response to Banda's dictatorship was complicated. Western nations appreciated his anti-communist stance and economic conservatism during the Cold War, providing aid and maintaining diplomatic relations despite the obvious authoritarianism. African nations condemned his relationships with apartheid, South Africa, and Portuguese colonialism, but couldn't isolate him economically. International aid organizations worked in Malawi despite the political situation, justifying their presence by pointing to development needs. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, pressure for political reform was mounting. The Cold War's end removed Banda's anti-communist credentials as a shield. Drought and economic crisis in 1992 created widespread suffering. Catholic bishops issued a pastoral letter in March 1992, criticizing the government and calling for political reform, a remarkably brave act that signaled changing political dynamics. International donors began conditioning aid on political reforms. Banda, now in his 90s, faced pressures he could no longer easily suppress. In 1993, after months of mounting domestic and international pressure, Malawians voted in a national referendum on whether to maintain the one-party system or adopt multi-party democracy. Despite extensive government intimidation, propaganda efforts, and Banda's legendary control over the state apparatus, 63% voted for multi-party democracy, a stunning repudiation of the system Banda had built. A special assembly stripped Banda of his life president title. In 1994, Malawi held democratic elections. Hastings Banda, who had led Malawi for 30 years and governed it absolutely for most of that time, was defeated by Bakili Muluzi of the United Democratic Front. Banda retired peacefully but wasn't prosecuted for his regime's numerous documented crimes, a compromise that allowed the transition to proceed peacefully. He died in 1997 in South Africa at approximately 99 years old. His legacy remains profoundly and deeply contested. He led Malawi to independence and built essential basic infrastructure. He also created a dictatorship that jailed and killed opponents, controlled every aspect of people's lives, and concentrated wealth while most Malawians remained poor. Both the liberator and the dictator were the same person, and Malawians still wrestle with how to remember him. Chapter 6. Democratic Transition to Present. On May 17, 1994, Malawians went to the polls for the first multi-party election in the country's history. Bakili Muluzi, leader of the United Democratic Front, won 47% of the vote, defeating Hastings' Banda and ending 30 years of one-party dictatorship. Muluzi was Malawi's first Muslim president, a significant symbol in a country where Christianity had dominated political life since the missionary era. The UDF won 82 of 177 seats in the National Assembly and formed a coalition government with the Alliance for Democracy. The peaceful transition from authoritarian rule to multi-party democracy was genuinely remarkable, a testament to Malawian resilience and civil society's determination to transform the political system. Muluzi's first term brought greater freedom of speech, assembly, and association, a dramatic contrast to life under Banda's repression. People could criticize the government without disappearing. Opposition parties could organize and campaign. Independent newspapers emerged. The atmosphere of fear that had characterized Banda's rule began to dissipate. These were real achievements worth celebrating. But democracy involves more than just elections and political freedoms. It requires functional institutions, rule of law, and genuine accountability. On these fronts, progress proved more complicated. Muluzi was re-elected in 1999 with 52.4% of the vote, defeating opposition leader Gwanda Chakwamba, but the election's aftermath included demonstrations, violence, and looting, with opponents alleging irregularities. During his second term, Muluzi drew increasing criticism for autocratic tendencies and corruption. In 2002, he proposed a constitutional amendment allowing him to run for a third term, despite the Constitution's explicit two-term limit. The proposal triggered widespread opposition from civil society, the legislature, courts, and ordinary Malawians, who had no interest in replacing one life president with another. Demonstrations erupted across the country. Parliament refused to pass the amendment. Facing overwhelming opposition, Muluzi abandoned the attempt, a crucial victory for Malawian democracy, showing that post-independence institutions could successfully resist executive aggrandizement. But Muluzi's administration became notorious for the maize scandal, one of the most devastating policy failures in Malawian history. In 2001, the government sold off the national grain reserve to other countries, generating millions of dollars in revenue. Shortly afterward, drought struck. Without the grain reserves that should have cushioned the crisis, famine spread across the country. Despite international pressure, the millions realized from the sale were never accounted for, widely suspected to have ended up in foreign accounts belonging to Muluzi and his supporters. The human cost was catastrophic: widespread malnutrition, deaths from starvation, and families selling assets to survive. The scandal exemplified how corruption directly kills people in poor countries, where government grain reserves represent the difference between hardship and starvation for millions living on subsistence agriculture. In 2004, Muluzi's hand-picked successor, Bingu wa Mutharika of the UDF, won the presidential election, though it was tainted by irregularities and criticized as unfair. Mutharika surprised everyone by taking anti-corruption seriously. He dramatically reduced ministerial positions, initiated investigations of prominent UDF officials accused of corruption, and made several high-profile arrests. His actions impressed international donors who had withheld aid during Muluzi's corruption-plagued second term. Aid resumed, providing crucial support for a country whose budget depended heavily on foreign assistance. The relationship between Mutharika and Muluzi deteriorated rapidly. In February 2005, Mutharika left the UDF, of which Muluzi remained chairman, and formed the Democratic Progressive Party. The UDF responded by bringing impeachment proceedings against Mutharika in the National Assembly, which voted to begin the process in October. International pressure from donor countries and neighbouring leaders eventually convinced opponents to withdraw the motion in early 2006, but the political warfare continued. Malusi was arrested on corruption charges in July 2006, though charges were dropped due to alleged lack of evidence. He was arrested again in 2008 in connection with an alleged plot to overthrow Mutharika, and once more in February 2009 for allegedly embezzling millions in donor funding. The pattern suggested political prosecutions and genuine corruption concerns had become thoroughly entangled. Mutharika was re-elected in May 2009, soundly defeating opposition candidates including John Tembo, though many alleged widespread voting irregularities. International monitors noted Mutharika had unfair advantages, particularly through state-controlled media that failed to provide balanced coverage. His second term saw increasing authoritarianism. In July 2011, protests erupted over high costs of living, declining foreign relations, poor governance, and lack of foreign exchange reserves. The government's response was brutal. 18 people died, and at least 44 suffered gunshot wounds. The violence exposed how quickly democratic gains could erode when leaders prioritized control over accountability. Mutharika died suddenly in office in April 2012. Despite attempts by some officials to prevent the constitutional succession, Vice President Joyce Banda assumed the presidency, becoming Malawi's first female president. Her rise was particularly remarkable because Mutharika had expelled her from the DPP in 2010, when she resisted his attempts to groom his brother Peter as successor. Unable to remove her constitutionally, Mutharika had ostracized her politically, with allies mocking her humble background as a small businesswoman. But when Mutharika died, the constitution was clear. She became president, exactly as designed, demonstrating that constitutional provisions could function even against powerful resistance. Banda served until 2014, when she lost the election to Peter Mutharika, Bingu's younger brother. Peter Mutharika governed from 2014 to 2020, continuing some of his brother's policies while attempting his own forms of executive aggrandizement. The 2019 election was particularly controversial. Mutharika was declared the narrow winner, but opposition parties challenged the results, alleging massive irregularities and vote rigging. What happened next was historic. In February 2020, the Constitutional Court annulled the election and ordered a rerun. In May, the Supreme Court upheld the decision. This was the first time in African history that a court had successfully annulled a presidential election and enforced a rerun despite government resistance. The ruling demonstrated the strength of Malawian institutions. Civil society mobilized mass protests. The judiciary ruled against unconstitutional actions despite enormous pressure. The Electoral Commission was forced to conduct a new, better supervised election. On July 2, 2020, opposition leader Lazarus Chakwera won the rerun election and became president. Mutharika accepted defeat, allowing peaceful transfer of power. The entire episode, from challenged election through court battles to peaceful transition, showed democratic resilience that many African countries have yet to achieve. However, in September 2025, Peter Mutharika returned to power by winning the presidential election, demonstrating that Malawian democracy continues to evolve, with power changing hands through electoral processes. The pattern of incumbent defeats Banda in 1994, Joyce Banda in 2014, Peter Mutharika in 2020, and Chakwera in 2025 shows that Malawian voters genuinely control who governs them, even as challenges to democratic quality persist. Throughout the democratic period, Malawi has faced crushing economic and social challenges that would test any government. HIV and AIDS became a national catastrophe, beginning in the 1990s. Adult prevalence reached 15%, with approximately 850,000 people living with HIV by the early 2000s. Between 1985 and 2001, an estimated 500,000 adults and children died of AIDS or AIDS-related diseases. The epidemic particularly affected people aged 15 to 49, the most economically productive segment of the population, weakening every socio-economic structure. Teachers, doctors, nurses, government officials, and skilled workers died in devastating numbers, destroying institutional memory and capacity across public and private sectors. The impact on families was catastrophic. Children were orphaned by the hundreds of thousands. Elderly people lost their adult children and were left caring for grandchildren without breadwinners. Families sold assets to pay medical expenses, depleting savings and falling into deeper poverty. Women, already disadvantaged by gender inequality in education, employment and healthcare access, bore disproportionate burdens as caregivers while facing higher infection rates due to economic dependence, gender-based violence, and inability to negotiate condom use. Malawi responded with prevention programs, treatment expansion, and eventually antiretroviral therapy programs that have reduced prevalence and extended lives, but HIV remains a significant public health challenge decades later. Poverty has remained stubbornly entrenched. Approximately 70% of Malawians live below $2.15 per day, making Malawi one of the poorest countries globally. About 51% live below the national poverty line, with poverty concentrated heavily in rural areas where 60% of rural residents experience poverty compared to 18% in urban areas. The southern region has the highest poverty rate at 65%. These aren't just statistics. They represent millions of people struggling to feed families, unable to afford healthcare or education, vulnerable to every drought, flood, or economic shock. The economy remains overwhelmingly dependent on agriculture, which accounts for roughly 1/3 of GDP, employs 64% of the workforce, and constitutes over 80% of export earnings. Tobacco alone represents 60% of total exports, creating an economic trap. The world increasingly understands tobacco's devastating health consequences, yet Malawi's economy depends on producing it. Diversification efforts have had limited success. Climate change has made agriculture increasingly precarious, with droughts and floods devastating harvests. Child malnutrition remains severe, with 37% of children under 5 suffering from stunting due to chronic malnutrition, affecting their physical and cognitive development permanently. Malawi's challenges are interconnected in ways that make them particularly difficult to address. Poverty drives agricultural dependence, which creates vulnerability to climate shocks, which deepens poverty. HIV weakens families and institutions, which undermines economic productivity, which perpetuates poverty, which increases HIV transmission through economic desperation. Gender inequality limits women's education and economic opportunities, which increases HIV vulnerability, which deepens poverty, which perpetuates gender inequality. Breaking these cycles requires coordinated interventions across multiple sectors, but government capacity remains limited, and corruption diverts resources that should address these problems. Yet Malawi has also shown remarkable resilience and progress in specific areas. Democratic institutions have proven stronger than many observers expected. Civil society organizations, churches, human rights groups, university communities actively hold government accountable. The judiciary has demonstrated genuine independence in landmark cases. Educational access has expanded significantly, with the primary education gender gap eliminated by the early 2000s, though quality and completion rates remain concerns. HIV treatment programs have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. community-based programs have created local solutions to development challenges. The country's geographic beauty remains stunning, and tourism has potential for growth. Lake Malawi's biodiversity continues to attract researchers and visitors. National parks have been revitalized, with conservation efforts bringing back wildlife populations. The Warm Heart of Africa reputation reflects genuine cultural values of hospitality and community support that persist despite economic hardship. Malawians have built multi-party democracy from authoritarian rule, demonstrated judicial independence, enforced constitutional transitions despite powerful resistance, and repeatedly shown that ordinary citizens will mobilize to defend democratic gains. Looking forward, Malawi faces immense challenges but also possibilities. Climate change will require adaptation in agriculture, potentially forcing the crop diversification that economic logic has long suggested. Reducing tobacco dependence while protecting farmer livelihoods demands creative solutions and international support. Addressing HIV requires sustained funding and breaking down gender barriers that increase women's vulnerability. Combating poverty requires better governance, reduced corruption, improved infrastructure, educational quality, and economic diversification. Strengthening democratic institutions requires constant vigilance against executive aggrandizement and genuine accountability for corruption. The Malawi of 2026 is dramatically different from the Malawi of 1964 at independence, and incomparably different from the pre-colonial Maravi Confederacy or the landscape Livingstone encountered in 1859. From ancient migrations through the slave trade's horrors, from colonial exploitation through Banda's dictatorship to multi-party democracy's messy realities, Malawian history has been shaped by resilience and adaptation. The challenges ahead are real and serious, but Malawians have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to demand better governance, defend constitutional principles, and work toward more just futures. That history of resilience offers hope that current challenges, daunting though they are not insurmountable.